Okay, we'll tell you what, maybe why don't we go ahead and get started? We'll start with introductions in the interest of time. I know that Rick is going to join us from the state, but I don't see him online yet. I see that Dina's online, so we might move things around a little bit on the agenda if we have to. But why don't we just go around and get started with introductions. I'll call folks out as I see on my screen, okay? But I'm Andy Gunning with PPACG here, the executive director. Yarek, why don't you get started?
So I'm Yarek. I live in Manitou Springs. I work with lots of power grid data and air quality data.
Very good. Katie.
Hi there, Katie Helm, Conservation and Sustainability Manager for the City of Fountain.
Very good. Thank you, Katie. Melinda.
Hi, I'm Melinda Norris. I'm currently filling in for air program at Schriever until we get a replacement for our last air program manager.
Super, good. Well, thank you. Jessica.
Hi, air program on Fort Carson.
Super, thank you. Kevin.
I'm Kevin Shrewsbury. I'm an environmental specialist at Colorado Springs Utilities.
Very good. Keeping with the CSU theme. Chris.
Hi, everyone. Chris Welch, Colorado Springs Utilities Environmental.
Great. Thank you, sir. Jacob.
Hello, everybody. Jacob Madsen, Planning Supervisor with Mountain Metro Transit.
Howdy. Melinda.
I'm with Schriever.
Oh, yeah, I'm sorry. Sorry, names are jumping around on me now. I hate that. Who did I miss? Oh, Carly.
Hi, Air Quality Program Manager at Peterson and Cheyenne Mountain.
Very good. Jared.
Good afternoon, everyone. Jared Verner, Public Information Officer at PPACG.
Okay, very good. Let me see. Oh, Dina.
Hi, everyone. This is Dina Boytalk with Two Roads Environmental here in support of the Pikes Peak Council of Governments.
Very good. I feel like I'm missing a few folks. Oh, Victoria snuck in. Victoria.
It did sneak in. Hi, Victoria Chavez, El Paso County.
Very good. Welcome. Did I miss anybody? Okay, very good. Or chime in if I did. And I'm sure Rick Coffin will be joining us momentarily from the state. I did ask him to give us an update on how things are looking at our two monitors here, and actually a couple other monitors as well that might be of interest, just to see where our numbers are looking so far this summer. It's been a decent summer, I think, and thankfully, knock on wood, wildfire has not been too much of an impact, at least down here, but would be good to get a kind of a snapshot as to where things stand so far. Getting ahead of myself a little bit, was there any public comment that anybody wanted to make on anything that's not on the agenda? I don't know that we've got folks from the general public online today. Going once. Okay, going into our information items. Dina, if you're ready to go, why don't I turn it over to you, and I'll see if I can ping Rick and see if he's still going to be able to join us. But we sent out with the agenda a really great resource that Dina's put together describing potential ozone non-attainment designation and just lots of details that'll be helpful to know, potentially not too far down the road. But with that, Dina, let me turn it over to you.
Sure. So I didn't know whether or not I should walk through the document, or if everybody had received a copy of that and just wanted to hit some highlights and more so go into questions or a discussion about that. So I would look for some direction from you, Andy, or the AQTC members.
I would say maybe hit the highlights. Yeah, why don't we keep it, we can keep it fairly high level, but we can hit maybe a couple of key highlights, maybe in each section. Just take a few minutes to maybe identify a few kind of key things that are popping out here. And then focusing on maybe the process that EPA may go through, implications, and things like that. And yeah, we'll answer questions along the way.
Okay. So I put this together at Andy's request, just because there was a number of inquiries that had come in, and there was some thought about, how to broadly get everybody up to speed on some of the issues related to ozone. So I know you guys have been talking about ozone for a number of years, and that the levels have been hovering somewhere around 70 parts per billion, which is currently the ozone, or the more stringent ozone 8-hour standard. And so we wanted to take a little time to talk about both the process and timing and implications in terms of, any potential non-attainment designation. I do want to highlight at the beginning of this that the area is currently designated as attaining the ozone standard. So many of these requirements get triggered with a non-attainment designation. That non-attainment designation does not automatically, happen every year. So there's some actions that actually trigger that. And so I just want to highlight these do not apply to the area at this time. They would apply, and the timing would get triggered if there was a non-attainment designation at a future date. So I'm not going to spend much time on introduction to ozone, because hopefully you've gotten some of that that background from here and there. We have been tracking the maximum daily 8-hour average values over time at both of these two monitors, at the Air Force Academy and at Manitou, over time. So we've been looking very closely at what's happening this summer. We have had some lower ozone values just because we've been getting some cloud cover. At the same time, it seems like, there's potential for some wildfire influence that may have happened earlier in May, and then more recently in August. I don't know that the August, I've seen it when driving around the North Front Range. I'm not sure yet whether or not that's been visible down in the Springs, or there's any impact. So that might be a question to ask of the Air Division in the future, as to whether or not they might be pursuing or evaluating for wildfire influence at the monitors. Regardless, when you look at identifying how the area is meeting or how they compare to the ozone standard, so you look at the maximum daily 8-hour value at each monitor, and then you look at that average of those maximum daily 8-hour average values over a 3-year period. But you don't automatically use the highest value, you use the 4th highest daily 8-hour average. So it's a little complicated. Regardless, as you can see in this table, in recent years, the values have been higher than the 70 parts per billion standard. And in actuality, what we look for is anything higher than 71, because of a kind of a nuance of looking at the truncation versus averaging or rounding, I guess, of the ozone monitored values. So regardless, as you can see, both of the monitors have been kind of hovering around or above 70 parts per billion. And so the question begs, what does that mean for the area? And so again, the area has currently been designated as an attainment area. That means the attainment dates that you hear about so often don't necessarily apply. They actually don't apply to the area. They only apply to areas that have been designated as non-attainment. So that's a big distinction that I want to make sure everybody understands. There's a question, does EPA ever designate areas outside of their typical process? And that is a big question. So let's talk a little bit about timing and jumping into the process of a designation. So when EPA issues a new standard, or they reconsider the current standard, that will trigger a process. So you need to actually have one of those actions that happen. So when they do that, they issue a new standard or that reconsideration, there is a schedule that they follow, and there's a nice diagram that kind of goes along with that. And figure 1. So the timing kind of triggers off of that action. EPA has already done that for the 2015 ozone standard. And because they've already done that, and the data set that they looked at for both of the Air Force Academy and the Manitou monitors, that is resulted in the area being designated as attainment. So for EPA to rethink that, and perhaps, reevaluate that, we would need either a new standard or a new reconsideration that comes out that officially triggers this process. So again, this process only applies with those new or reconsidered standards. And then some of the attainment deadlines and SIP requirements only get triggered for areas that were officially designated as non-attainment. So again, that's not the area, but this is just kind of a giving you an idea, should that happen, what that timing might be. And when you do get triggered to be a non-attainment area, or designated, excuse me, the 2 and 3 years time frame might seem like a long time, but it's really not, because there's a lot of process that has to go into that into evaluating and satisfying EPA requirements. So being aware of it is the first step, and then understanding how to move forward in terms of proactively planning. You guys are already proactively taking steps to reduce ozone, whether it's through the public and education campaigns or the specific actions that are being taken at various facilities. So there are things that you are actively doing, proactively doing, and in part being part of the EPA's advanced program is helping to that extent. So again, making sure that everybody understands what the process is pretty critical. So again, you guys are currently designated as attainment. Therefore, these timelines do not apply to you at this time, but we do want to continue to track ozone because EPA does periodically go back and reconsider their standards like they were planning on doing with the ozone standard, the 2015 ozone standard. And we were initially thinking they were going to have a final action on that reconsideration later this year. And then yesterday they announced, or recently they announced, that they're going to go back and restart that entire process of reviewing the ozone standard. So at the culmination of that process, I would anticipate that there would likely be a new standard or a formal reconsideration, such that EPA would then go back and look at the data for all of the ozone monitors they have throughout the entire United States. And then they would look at a specific 3-year period. And again, that time frame is going to be triggered based on when they take their action. At that point, we want to be prepared for what happens based on what the data is telling us. So if they looked at the data right now, clearly you would see a 3-year average that's over the 71 part per billion truncated value that we talked about. And there would be a possibility of being designated as non-attainment. So we've talked about the process. There are times when EPA does designate an area out of the routine cycle, out of this outside of this timeline. They don't like to do that because, as you can imagine, looking at the data for all of the monitors throughout the entire nation is pretty tedious work. There's a lot of work to it. And so they like to keep everybody on the same cycle so that they can take formal national actions and not have to manage all of the different timelines associated with designated one area in this year and another area in this year. Now, where they get into the off-cycle, adjustments or maybe designations as being non-attainment, there have been situations where through maybe legal challenges, court decisions, that areas have been that were initially identified as an attainment area were redesignated as non-attainment. And in fact, that did happen in Colorado just a few years back, where the ozone non-attainment area, that's the Denver North Front Range area, did not go all the way to the Wyoming border. In fact, there was a narrow band of the state of the Weld County and Larimer County that was not identified as non-attainment. EPA was challenged on that, and then the final decision came back to where at least in Weld County, the non-attainment area was expanded to the border. So there are those unique cases where EPA can go back and rethink a decision that they had made in terms of being attainment or non-attainment. Not aware of any challenges related to the Pikes Peak area at this time. So talking a little bit about the implications, there are some automatic requirements that get triggered upon a non-attainment designation. Some of these happen by operation of law. Other things happen in terms of, an area having to develop rules or requirements that satisfy Clean Air Act obligations. And so that initial non-attainment designation, when EPA looks at it, they look at how close the area's design value or that 3-year average of the fourth maximum daily 8-hour average. They look at that value and say, how close was it to the 70 parts per million standard? And based on that is how they identify what classification an area is. And so based on what the values we're seeing for the Air Force Academy and Manitou, you would likely be identified as a marginal non-attainment area, which is the the least stringent out of the classifications. If the area was seeing much higher values, they might just jump into a higher classification. Basically, the higher classification, the more stringent requirements that must be put into place to help get that area back into attainment. And so what we would be looking at for our marginal non-attainment area would be some emission inventory reporting and some basic certifications. And then in 3 years from the time frame of that non-attainment designation, there would be an attainment date. If the area's data related to that 3-year time frame showed that it was meeting it, then you would remain non-attainment. But if you did not, then you might be downgraded then to a more stringent classification, so moving to perhaps moderate non-attainment. And so for those first few cycles of those 3-year cycles, you are looking at potential downgrades depending on if the area is meeting the standard or not. So that initial classification is based on how close you are to that standard, and then after that you just get downgraded if you are not meeting it. So it doesn't really matter how with the degree of the standard or the degree of the monitored values according to the standard. And as you step into those more stringent classifications, then additional requirements get put into place. And so upon a moderate non-attainment designation, that's when you're doing more stringent requirements. You're looking at controls for industry. You're making demonstrations in terms of reasonable further progress. You are also then looking at additional, like an attainment demonstration, which is a series of modeling exercises, kind of projecting what you're going to be at the next attainment date, and trying to identify, any additional and quantify any additional reduction strategies that you might put in place, and seeing how that affects those future ozone projections. So there are those administrative requirements. Obviously, there are regulatory requirements that get triggered. But in addition to that, there's been some discussion about costs of a non-attainment designation. And so what we did is we looked at a few studies of areas that seem to be in similar situations to understand what they estimated the impacts of a non-attainment designation. What was really interesting to me in looking at those studies is that not only did they identify costs of being a marginal non-attainment area, but they were projecting that they weren't going to be able to attain in that initial 3 years, and therefore would be downgraded to at least moderate. And so these costs got accounted for. It's really hard to do these kinds of costs because you need to have a really good idea of the industry in the area, as well as other categories of source or air pollution in the area. A lot of them did economic impacts estimating based on, they knew that a certain employer was considering, moving into the area or perhaps making a significant modification in the area, and they were estimating the additional either the loss of that economic development or the additional controls that an industry or industries had to incur in terms of meeting the newer, more stringent requirements. Those are the highlights. I think one thing I did not hit in this is, should there be a non-attainment designation, the area should plan on being in that non-attainment process for at least 2 10-year periods. So that not only is there the time that you are not meeting the ozone standard, built into that non-attainment planning and additional controls that would apply. But once an area then does come back and meet the standard, then there's 2 10-year periods that you have to monitor the ozone levels at the area and continue to apply, or implement additional requirements, making sure that you continue to meet the federal standards. So it's really at least a 20-year period of time that these additional requirements would take effect, if not more, depending on how an area is able to come back to meeting the federal standard once having been designated as non-attainment. So there's a lot in there. I think maybe I should just stop and take some questions at this point.
Yeah, good. Very good, Dina. Yeah, it's a lot of stuff that's packed in here, but we thought this would be super useful because this is going to be part of some conversations we'll be having for a while, I think, as EPA does its thing. Just 2 things I wanted to mention real quick. For some talk, not from folks that are on the call here today, but some folks say, well, if we just go into non-attainment, then we get some additional money, right? Like we get congestion mitigation air quality funds to do transportation projects that reduce emissions. So is it kind of worth it then? And we'd be able to apply for more state enterprise funds that are just set aside for non-attainment areas that areas outside of non-attainment aren't eligible for. And our response has been, no, it's absolutely not worth going into non-attainment for those very small increases that we would see in funding and other pots that we could apply for. Definitely not worth it, especially as you look at the numbers that Dina alluded to. Probably the best example that's closest to our situation is Oklahoma City. They're bigger than we are, probably we're maybe 2/3 their size, but they estimated, I think it was between $9 billion and $15 billion to be in non-attainment for a 23 roughly year period. So yeah, definitely not worth it with the revenue that would flow back to the region. And the other thing I'll mention real quick, also not worth it, and we would never want to be glommed onto the existing non-attainment area that's in Denver in the North Front Range MPO. We'd want to be our separate area altogether if we are going to get reclassified to non-attainment. Don't want to be don't want to hitch our wagon to what they're having to do up there. So we would definitely want to be a separate region. So I just wanted to throw those two out there as well. But yeah, why don't we open it up? Any other questions, thoughts, observations from folks? I know it's a lot of information to take in. Yeah, Chris.
Thanks, Andy, and thanks, Dina, for the great overview. And I think it's good to kind of get some of these things down on paper that we've been talking about for years now, Andy.
Yeah.
So we've kind of got a common point to go back to. So I think it's a great idea that we have this sort of white paper. A couple topics that I know we've kind of kicked around a lot that I'm wondering if it warrants at least some degree, at least of acknowledgement within this white paper. Would be and curious your thoughts, Dina, as well as yours, Andy, would be exceptional events. And maybe somehow even just like footnoting our data table to acknowledge that would be inclusive of exceptional events. And, if we were facing a designation, at that point we would weigh, or the state would weigh, whether it warranted going after any exceptional events as part of that EPA's consideration process in redesignation. And then another item, probably a little less relevant to this whole designation process that I know this white paper is focused on, but I know it's been a key topic, especially for you, Andy, lately, is some sort of acknowledgement of the issue of elevated background of ozone in the West. So even if it's just like a sentence or two, maybe in the summary of the issue section where we're describing what it is, just seems like it might be, from my standpoint, worth inserting those couple topics in there. So I'm just curious your guys' thoughts on that.
Good. Yeah, super. Dina, why don't you take the exceptional events question? Two great comments, and I'll try to handle the other in the background one.
Yeah, I would just, I agree. Those are great comments. The reason I didn't include that at this point, and Andy and I talked a little bit about it, is it gets really complicated as it is. The information in this, and trying to keep this white paper, we initially were trying to limit it to just a one page, which we laugh at now.
Yeah. It's a one pager, yeah.
And exceptional events definitely is something that we want to pay attention to, because it is a reality, and it has been accounted for in design values, or the values that you use in comparison to the ozone standard in recent years. However, I think you want to make sure that you're focusing any conversations about exceptional events when the data will count in terms of whatever 3-year period that EPA uses. The fact that there is this option to use it, but at the same time, I know in reality, EPA does not review exceptional events that don't make a difference in their mind. So that just means it doesn't, the area, whether or not the data is included associated with an exceptional event really doesn't change whether the area would be deemed as non-attainment or attainment, or therefore meeting standards or not. So we certainly can, think about how else to incorporate that, and we're certainly open to your ideas about that. So I'll let Andy respond to the elevated ozone and the levels in the west.
Sure. Yeah, appreciate that. And I thought about that too, Chris, about maybe we add just an addendum or an attachment, but we're still working on some charts, pie charts and tables that describe, it's not actual data, but it's modeled EPA data that they used in their forecasting to project that they thought that we would be in attainment in 2023. And, clearly we're right at the edge and maybe a little bit, we've been above the past couple of years. But I think including something like that, like a snapshot, just based on the best available data that is out there, I think would be helpful because it does make the point that there's a lot of background international emissions and naturally occurring emissions that are out of our control. That would be good to include as part of the conversation that we're dealing with a relatively smaller sliver of the pie, if you will, as we're trying to reduce emissions. We got to keep doing what we're doing with our travel reduction programs and transit zero fare and the great work that you guys are doing at CSU and so forth. But that's an important part of the message, and we've kind of struggled with how should we include it here or just kind of hold it out as something separate at this point. So it's been a little bit separate, but I could see a need for maybe an addendum to this, an attachment that does describe our makeup, if you will, as far as our emissions based on the EPA data that's available out there. And while I'm on that, yes, you're right, Chris, really good conversations that we've started having earlier this year with other Western regions that are really impacted by the same thing. So really good conversations with folks like in Phoenix and Salt Lake City and Boise and others, and we're all feeling the same thing. So I can share that we're working on a letter that we're probably going to get authorization by the board here at PPACG to send off to seek some direction and some feedback and some collaboration, if you will, from EPA to try to figure out how do we deal with background levels that are, we're kind of classifying them, describing them as locally uncontrollable, that we just don't have any control over, whether it's wildfire smoke in other parts of our state or in other states, or international emissions, or other natural emissions that we don't have any control over. So much more to come on that real soon, I hope. And what I'd like to do is brief this group on all of that when we get back together again in September.
Can I ask one more question before we move on?
Yeah.
How would people envision using this white paper? Like who is the audience? Are you talking about, more broadly like elected officials? Are you talking about and perhaps the public, or are you talking more about, people that are more in the know? Because I think the people more in the know, yes, you would want to add more details, but if you want to, get the high level information out there, it may be harder. It may, maybe you don't want all of the details. So if you would think about how you would want to use this white paper, like, how are you vetting it? That could help inform how we, perhaps revise it.
Yeah, I mean, this is probably a lot of information that is mostly going to be used by practitioners and those that are a little bit closer to the overall topic, because we've joked about how at the other end of the spectrum, if we actually are going to try to brief our federal elected delegation on some of the challenges we're dealing with here too. They're not going to read an 8-page white paper, but we've joked about trying to come up with like a 3x5 or a 4x6 index card that describes the nature of the challenge and what's out of our control, but what we're trying to do about it as well. So yeah, it's as you all know, this is a complicated topic, a lot of moving parts, and not easily digestible and explainable. But yeah, so we're working with a bunch of different tools we might end up using from a communication standpoint.
Yeah, thanks for those responses from both of you. Really appreciate it. And Andy, I like your idea, kind of the both approach. I think it is complex enough that you need a white paper this long to kind of really talk through the issues and describe all the different facets of it. But I think you also probably need an executive summary or your 3x5 for your elevator speech when you're meeting with elected officials. So probably a both approach.
Yep. Sounds good. Appreciate that. Yeah, sorry.
Victoria's had her hand up for a while, so I wanted to make sure she had a chance to talk.
Yeah, Victoria, yeah, go for it.
No, you really walked right into my question of, what are we going to do with this paper now that we have it? And is this something we're going to brief the board on, at least at PPACG level? Because I think this is something they are interested in. I don't think they have, that many of them have a ton of background on it. So I think this information is great, but we do have to figure it out a way to get it to the PPACG board, and then beyond that, the other elected officials who don't necessarily sit on the board, because that's where the action's going to come from. And that's where staff direction comes from. So I do really strongly feel like they need to have some level of understanding of this issue and the financial aspects of it.
Yeah, for sure. Good points, because that'll get their attention. One other thing that just popped in my head as you were describing that, Victoria, is in a conversation with Commissioner Vanderwerf a couple of weeks ago, I promised that I would put together some talking points around this overall topic as well. So that's in the works and kind of fits in with the number of different communication pieces that we will have out there. My plan is to get the white paper and some other information to the PPACG board in September, actually. So Dina and I have been working on that quite a bit, and happy to share what we end up taking to the board. It's going to be this plus the challenges that I've mentioned around background ozone as well, because that's a big challenge, and we're seeing some possible partnerships to work on that issue going forward. But it's going to take some political will here and at the federal level, and hopefully our state folks kind of being on board as well. But technically, it's a challenging issue too. But yeah, and kind of Dina alluded to this as well. We found out, I think it was on Monday, an announcement came out by EPA that they accepted a recommendation. They didn't act on it. The recommendation was made internally by this Clean Air Scientific Advisory Committee, suggested lowering the 70 parts per billion standard down to, I think, a floor of 55 parts per billion and a ceiling of 65. The EPA administrator said, thanks, but we're going to open up an overall broader review of the standard starting in 2024 and consider other scientific bases for making another adjustment or change or what have you to the standard. So kind of good news, bad news. It takes the pressure off of knowing that the standard was going to get lowered in the short term. But for next year, it's going to be a real challenge starting next year. So we're thinking maybe this is a good time to start having these conversations about what we're impacted by in our region and other parts of the Intermountain West with these high levels of background. But there's going to be a lot of pressure to lower it as well. So yeah, a lot of challenges ahead coming down the pike. So we're doing what we can to just attain the 70 parts per billion, but have some real concerns if that does get lowered. But anyways, they're going to open up and have a broader conversation starting next year. So more to come on that as well. So yes, a long way of answering your question, Victoria. We need to brief. We're going to brief our board, and happy to brief other boards and commissions and councils and whatnot out there that have an interest in weighing in here as well.
Great, thanks.
Okay.
And
Sure.
do you have any problems if I share this with my legislative folks at the county?
No, go for it. Yeah.
Awesome, thank you.
Good, you're welcome. Good. Any other questions, thoughts, suggestions? This is really helpful. This is what we were sort of hoping for. Because you guys, you get it, and you're working in it either directly or indirectly with measures that you're working on that reduce emissions. So we thought it was important to get this in front of you guys for sure. But anything else before we move on? Which, by the way, I still don't see Rick, so we may have I may have misfired with him. I thought he said he was free today, but maybe he wasn't after all. So we will roll that over into our next meeting in September to have him give an update. Okay. Yeah.
Andy, I do have a little bit of information I could share. I was just hoping Rick's would be probably more polished, but looking at the data that's been we've seen so far, and again, none of this is certified, so none of it is official, but it's looking like thus far in the season, so we're getting late in the summer season, so we, less likely to see higher values, although we have seen some recently. The fourth max value that we've seen at Manitou, fourth max 8-hour value has been 69 parts per billion. And then at the Air Force Academy, the fourth max has been 63 parts per billion. So we've seen lower values at the Air Force Academy than we've seen at the Manitou monitor, which I think is interesting because it might be, the elevation may play into that, seeing the different values at the different monitors. I did also then look at the, we've talked a little bit about looking just at the monitor, what we call the Gothic monitor that is up in Gunnison, and there's really nothing around it, just, for reference in terms of, what background levels are. The fourth max value there is 66. So with no sources around it that are, air pollution sources around it, just kind of that's more indicative of what you see in terms of background. You're seeing that at 66 parts per billion. And then I also looked at Pueblo Rest, and I think their fourth max value was 67. That's not a certified monitor. In fact, it only started running in February, so it's just more looking at it from as a frame of reference in comparison to what is being seen are observed at the Manitou and Air Force Academy monitors.
Yes, Yorick.
Andy, yes, and Dana, I want to confirm that, again, those are not certified numbers, but this dashboard application that we have for Manitou Springs and Manitou Springs Ozone Monitor exactly aligns with what you said, Dana. There were only like 4 exceptional, I don't want to call it necessarily exceptional events, but high ozone value events. And the fourth one is around exactly what you mentioned, 69 parts per billion. But this is to say, this is very close for my comfort, for example, because it's enough. We still are in a season in the summer. It's enough to have 2 days where this ozone level exceeds 70 parts per billion, and the situation would entirely turn around.
Yep.
Yeah, good points. Yeah.
In that case, I know we did see those significant kind of, at least visually, we saw smoke in that May 20th through the 23rd. And so we did see a couple of high values there for at least the Manitou monitor and Air Force Academy, I think. Yeah, those accounted for 2 of those days as well. So that, again, asking about exceptional events and asking what the Air Pollution Control Division is thinking in terms of, what they saw those days and whether or not, a demonstration could be easily made. And when I say easily, I don't want to discount that is a really heavy lift for the Air Pollution Control Division to do. And just because they do the analysis doesn't ever mean that EPA will review it. So sometimes it's doing a lot of work for, EPA, wouldn't even take the time to review it because they're actually focusing on other areas where it may make a more significant impact in whether they're attaining or not. So anyway, more to come. Clearly, we want to track this and we want to hear what the Air Division has to say as well.
And I also, from my side, I use the exceptional event term, but I really meant to say high ozone value, because those exceptional events, what you mean by them, my understanding would be wildfires, for example, that come to Colorado and cause increased levels of ozones. Yes, that would be something very different. And we had a very wet summer, as it sounds like, and I'm not aware of many of those actual exceptional events that may affect our high ozone values.
Right. Yeah, good points. And I appreciate Dina mentioned the Gothic monitor. That's something that's been on our radar. It kind of makes our point that we're dealing with high levels of background, not just here, but across the state, obviously. But if the Gothic monitor is hitting 66 parts per billion and there's nothing up there but antelope and elk and stuff like that. Clearly we're dealing with just high levels that we just don't have any control over to start with. And that's where we need some help from EPA to figure this out. Good. Anything else we need to chat about? Anything on people's minds or things they're working on they wanted to bring up? Keep up the great work, MMT and Fountain, on your zero fare transit service. Sounds like things have been off the charts in a good way, so that's really good to hear. And we may see you guys up next month for a brief update on that, if that's okay, Jacob and Katie.
Yeah, sure thing. There's a lot of very exciting things to report, and be more than happy to do that next month.
Good. Okay, Dina, anything else we need to bring up?
I was just going to ask for an update on ridership. So you already beat me to the punch on getting an update for that next month. Sorry.
Tell you what, I'll spoil some of the surprise if you don't mind. So
sure.
July, we had 353,189 boardings on our fixed route service, and that is a record for us, highest single month we've had. So very, very exciting there. And then we also, can't recall off the top of my head, but we also had another huge month in June as well. So we have high hopes for August here as August comes to a close, but it's been a resounding success from the ridership perspective for sure.
It's wonderful.
Yeah, it's really good. Yeah, exceeded what pre-pandemic levels, like July 2019 blew past those as well. So that's really good.
Yep, past all levels, all months for many years back. So yeah, very excited. And we were 62% over for just percentages, 62% higher than what we were last year in July. So it was a well deserved, I guess. I don't know if that's the right word for it, but very happy to see the results that we saw.
Yeah, good. Really good to hear. Cool. Okay, well, good. Anything else we need to cover? Okay, thank you all. Good to see everybody. And we will see you at the end of September. I think September 27th is our next dates, and happy to give you an update on what we did with the PPACG board as far as the briefing and direction there on getting EPA support, and lots more to talk about, I'm sure. So yeah, good to see everyone, and we'll see you next month.